Well, good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us here, the intersection of faith and culture. This is the Meeting House here on Faith Radio. Great to welcome to the program Bob Krech. He is a former elementary teacher, supervisor, curriculum developer, and the founder of Belief Books. He has written this book that is entitled A Little Faith, A Father's Miracle Story of Faith, Hope, Love, and a Micro Preemie. Bob Krech joining us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio. Sir, it is great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for being willing to tell your story today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio this afternoon.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, let's go back to the beginning, if you will, of this story. Name of the book is A Little Faith, and it, of course, pays tribute to your daughter, whose name is Faith. She was born at just 22 weeks old. As the subtitle suggests, she was a micro preemie. So tell us just a bit about that, well, very unique and challenging journey that you and your wife, Karen, went through.
Yeah, so really it began November of 1992. I was a teacher. I had the day off. I was home with Karen. She was 22 weeks pregnant. My son, Andrew, was 2 years old, and it was a beautiful sunny morning. We were all just playing together on the carpet in the family room. Karen left the room for a second, went to the bathroom, came back a minute later and said there was just a little bleeding. So I said, all right, well, maybe we should call the doctor, and she did. Doctor said, yeah, come on in this afternoon. This isn't really unusual, but let's check it out. So we went over there in the afternoon. Nurse saw Karen and said, Karen, you look great. Your weight is really good. How are you feeling? Karen said, I feel fine. But then the nurse began an exam and hooked her up to a monitor, and everything just kind of stopped. And she said, it looks like you might be having contractions. Are you feeling any? Karen said, no. She goes, all right, let me have the doctor come in. So he came in, did an exam, and said, okay, you are having contractions. You have begun to dilate. So why don't you get dressed? We'll meet in my office. So we did. We went over, sat down. He said, okay, so it looks like this baby is going to be born very soon, probably within a week. We're going to try to hold it off as best we can. But I got to tell you, things don't look very good. For the baby to be born now, it's most likely she would not be born alive. So we were just shocked, but he said, go directly to the hospital. I'll meet you there, and we'll begin some intervention. So we did. Long story short, they were able to hold off the birth for 2 days, but then Sunday, November 8th in the afternoon, Karen's water broke, and we were in a delivery room with one nurse, and all of a sudden she rang a bell, as Karen said, it's happening. Surrounded by nurses, equipment, and everything. And this little baby was born alive. Just so tiny, just would fit in your hand. I'd never seen anything so small. So she was whisked into this group of nurses, surrounded by equipment. The neonatologist walked over to Karen and said, Karen, how are you doing? Karen said, I'm fine. How's the baby? She said, well, the baby's very weak. She can't breathe on her own. We're keeping her heart and breathing going with machines. She's very, very small. She's under a pound. And what we're going to do now, really the best we can do, is give the baby to you. You hold her, keep her warm till she passes on. And again, we were just stunned. And I think I said, you're kidding. And she said, no, babies like this don't make it. But we insisted on intervention. She said, okay, I'll bring her down to the NICU at your direction. So she did, and everybody whisked out of the room. They took Karen to the OR because she had lost some blood. And I walked out into the hallway, was heading back to Karen's original room, and I ran into her obstetrician. And I said, the baby was born alive. I was just thrilled. And he said, yeah, but don't get your hopes up. This is still not looking very good. I said, all right. I felt like he just pressed my shoulders down and sat me down and said, here's the real deal. But he did say, you can go to the NICU now. They're expecting you. It's like, okay, great. So I went in, and there was the baby. She was in a tray under a warmer light, surrounded by nurses, just stick thin and struggling and straining, wires and tubes everywhere. I saw the neonatologist and I said, "How's the baby doing?" She kind of reiterated, she's not breathing on her own. We got her on a respirator. She's on 100% oxygen. We're keeping her going with machines. And then she gave me a litany of the things that were bad and could go wrong. But at the end of it, she said, but she is hanging in there. And she said, if she can make 24 hours, her chances will increase dramatically. And if she can make 72 hours, she would be considered viable. And my question was, what does viable mean? She goes, that she has a chance.
Wow.
So that kind of gave me the perspective. But then at the very end of it, she said, we just got to keep praying. Yeah. And I'd been praying, but they had kind of been these sort of wishes tossed in the air, like, please save her, please keep her alive. But I felt so much better knowing that the neonatologist was praying for her too. So we were with her over the next 2 days in the hospital. It was the same thing every day. Things look terrible. She's critical. She's not doing this. She's not doing that, but she's hanging in there. So after 2 days, Karen was discharged. We went home and I was by the side of the bed praying in earnest, but I wasn't feeling a connection. I wasn't feeling a peace. And I got up and I called the NICU because they told us we had 24/7 access. So I figured, let me test it. I called, I got the neonatologist. She said, well, the baby's not having a very good morning. So I said, well, what does that mean? She said, her potassium is very high. We haven't been able to bring it down. If we don't bring it down, we could lose her very soon from heart failure. So I said, all right, thank you. And she said, still, we're going to try. I said, good, that's what we need. And I knelt down at the bed again and began to pray again. Just save her, please keep her alive, bring her potassium down. But again, I didn't feel the connection. Now, I went to church, but I grew up in the Catholic Church. We didn't study the Bible. I never read the Bible whatsoever. But at that point, I got up from the bed, didn't know what else to do. I was completely helpless. Looked out the back window, and suddenly 2 fragments of verses dropped into my head. And again, not a Bible study person, but I've been at church enough, I guess, that these pieces stuck. And I wasn't looking for verses. I wasn't searching for that. This is just what dropped into my head. It wasn't a voice. But one was, have the faith as a mustard seed and you can move mountains. And the other was, knock and you'll be answered, seek and you will find. And I remember feeling like, this is important. I've got to do something with this. So I took the one Bible we had in the house, leafing through it, trying to find it, had no idea where to look. Fortunately, I had a friend at seminary. I called him. I figured he must know. And as soon as I told him, he said, oh, yeah, that's Matthew 7:7, Matthew 17. I said, okay, good. So I looked them up and I started reading them. And then I took those verses and I knelt down again and I prayed. And this time I felt like, God, you're speaking to me. These are promises from you. And I'm going to claim them. And I'm going to trust you. And then I felt peace. For the first time since the whole thing started, I felt some kind of peace. And really, that was the moment that my life turned.
Oh, wow.
And, I began to understand that I need to devote my life to God.
Well, you're listening to Meeting House here on Faith Radio. Author Bob Krech joining us today, and he has written this book called A Little Faith, subtitled A Father's Miracle, Story of Faith, Hope, Love, and a Micro Preemie. And Bob, I want you to share with us now as we might say, the next steps that occurred. You talked about what God had done in your own heart and how he had offered to you by his Spirit a couple of scriptures for you to hold on to. You began to hold on to the promises of God. Faith is your preemie daughter. holding on to life there in the neonatal intensive care unit. So tell me what happened next.
So we did go back that afternoon to see how she was doing because of the concern with potassium. And she was in the same boat, potassium was still high. But again, the nurses were kind of thinking, she's hanging in there, she's a fighter. It's like, okay. So that night we went back again, same story, still very critical, still on the respirator. And when I went home that night and finally went to bed, this was kind of the second thing that God did for me in this process. I had a dream, and I'm not the kind of person who dreams, who has premonitions, hasn't happened before or since. But that night I dreamt I was in the NICU with Faith. She was alone in the warmer, and there was a nurse standing by who I'd never seen before. And she was wearing like an old-fashioned nurse's outfit with a high white hat. There was like a feeling of warmth around her and light. And as I came towards her, I could feel like I shouldn't get too close, but I didn't feel threatened. And she just said, Faith is going to be all right. And I said, thank you. And I just felt this comfort and warmth. And when I woke up the next morning, the same thing. I felt that comfort and warmth that she was going to be okay. And I didn't tell anybody. I didn't even tell my wife because I didn't want people to think, oh, we had a dream, everything's going to be fine. But that's kind of what I believed in my heart. So over the next few days, it was the same thing, touch and go, but she just kept hanging in there. And, I discovered the prayer room at the hospital, and I was in there every day. And also at this time, I was driving there at night and driving back, and it was November, it was cold, and turned on the radio, and I began to hear Christian radio. I'd never paid it. I would always dial through it before, but now I was starting to listen, and I heard these great shows and pointing me to different authors that I began to read about. So I actually went to a Christian bookstore for the first time and found all these Bibles. I found a great Bible with commentary. It was wonderful. So this whole world opened up to me at just the right time because it continued to support us. Faith ended up being in the hospital for 4 months. And she had, a couple infections, and she had a heart valve problem. There were all these different things, but we always managed to pray through it, and God took us through it. So now she's 28 years old. She was a 3-sport athlete. She's a search engine optimizer for a website development company. She's done really well. She's never been back to the hospital except for preemie reunions. And, all thanks to God, glory to God.
Amen. And as far as her physical condition, any physical expressions of what she had experienced, the result of being a preemie born at really just slightly less than a pound?
She had a little asthma growing up, but that left her when she was like 12. She had some perceptual problems, but she's a great compensator. So she did very well in school, both in elementary and high school and college. So she's doing really very well. It was interesting too. One of the things that's you have to be very careful with is the respirator and the oxygen, the effect on the eyes. And she was threatened possibly with blindness or some kind of real severe disability with her eyes. And so they kept checking that constantly. When she was out of the hospital, she had a follow-up visit. And the doctor who had checked her eyes said, her eyes are perfectly normal. She may need glasses at some point. And my response was, that's great. And he said, you have no idea how great this is.
That's awesome. Well, Bob Krech has been joining us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio, the author of the book, A Little Faith. And Bob, this event took place, the birth of your daughter, Faith, as a preemie, who actually was born at less than a pound and, of course, struggled for life during her first few hours of life, came through, This happened almost 3 decades ago. So why is it that you wanted to share this story at this point as we begin to close?
I've been trying to write this book for years. I've written like 35 books for teachers and kids. It's part of what I've always done. But this was very, very difficult to write. And you can imagine, I wanted to get it right. But it was interesting. Last fall, I read a book by Mark Batterson, where he had talked also about his struggle to write his first book and how he began to circle it in prayer. And it occurred to me, I've never prayed for this book. So then when I would sit down before I would write, I would pray. And it made a huge difference. In fact, along the way, I found Psalm 96:3. And in the New Living Translation, it says, publish his glorious deeds among the nations. Tell everyone about the amazing things he does. And they actually use the verb publish. So that was kind of like,
Wow.
oh, I'll do that.
So if you look, I got two very quick questions here as we close up. What would you say would be the major thing that God did in your life and your wife's life as you went through this challenge with faith?
Yeah. I had always been the kind of person who felt like I was in charge of my life. If I wanted to make something happen, I could make it happen. If something bad happened, we'd find the right person to fix it, the doctor, the hospital, whatever. But here we were in the right hospital with the right doctors, and they were all telling us there's no hope. So for the first time in my life, I was hopeless. And I actually had to turn it all over to God and say, you're the one who can help me here. I'm your servant. Let your will be done. In fact, that was part of what I had to come to terms with. We might lose her, but if that was God's will, I really prayed and said, I'll accept it. Help me to accept it. There's another verse I found that was great where we talk, Jesus has healed or is going to heal a little boy who has a demon. And the father comes to him and says, I believe, help me in my unbelief. And I felt that's me. It's exactly me.
That is awesome. So as we conclude, last question, what would you say would be the central message that you would want readers to take from this book?
Have faith, even as small as a mustard seed. Great things can happen. Be encouraged. Turn to God, whatever your circumstances, and he'll carry you through it.
That's awesome. Bob Krech joining us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio. And point us to your website. How can people find out more information about this book online?
Sure. It's beliefbooks.com. And at Belief Books, you can order a copy from your independent bookstore or Amazon or Barnes & Noble, anywhere. All proceeds from the book are donated to charities, and you could check out the charities at the website. There's a description and a link to them as well.
Outstanding, Bob Krech. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being so transparent about sharing your story, and God's blessings on you. Merry Christmas to you. Thanks for spending some time with us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio. Enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thanks very much. Merry Christmas.